Notes on session 689. See the first 3 sessions in Chapter 1 of Mass Events. See session 867. The disease Seth referred to as, and I've got to say this many times and I can't pronounce it, unconquered cases. I'm just going to call it cases, which is probably not even the pronunciation of that part, but it says it many times, so I'm going to call it cases, so that's what I'm talking about, this word right here, which is caused by a filarial parasite spread by the bite of the black fly. In his passing reference to it, Seth didn't mention that, besides producing the gruesome leathery skin, Satius can cause blindness. Hence its common name, river blindness. I'll just call it river blindness. That's easier. I can say that word. This most serious affliction appears to be centered in West Africa and infects many millions of people there. 4 centuries ago, it was carried to the Western Hemisphere by slaves and is now found in certain areas of Mexico south to Brazil. River blindness doesn't kill, and the percentage of victims who lose their sight varies according to location. We'd like to get more data from Seth on the experimental evolutionary aspects of the blindness. However, since we don't understand how such a debilitating state could really lead to something better. Perhaps in this particular biological experiment, the blindness represents an evolutionary dead end in those terms. We may ask Seth to elaborate before he finishes Mass Events. Indeed, it seems that he probably has available enough information on the evolutionary aspects of disease to fill a book. To use his own word, it would be fascinating should the 3 of us ever find the time to get to it. The whole idea of such biological experimentation makes us wonder just how and to what extent those impetuses may be involved with any of the ordinary diseases we're so used to thinking of as just that, diseases. Session 870. I'm just waiting, Jane said, after we'd been sitting for the session for perhaps 15 minutes. Come on, Seth, for Christ's sake, she said, with unintentional humor. It really bothers me when I don't start a session within a reasonable time. I wonder what kind of a block is there, you know. Then I think that right now there's some material I sense, but it hasn't fallen into the right slot yet. I just want dictation. Well, I guess I'm ready. She was entranced before she laid her glasses on the coffee table between us. Her eyes were very dark now when she started. She stared at me as Seth. Now, dictation. The blueprints for ideal developments exist within the pool of genetic knowledge, providing the species with multitudinous avenues for fulfillment. Those blueprints exist mentally as ideas. They express themselves through the impulses and creativity of the species' individual members. Your natural athletes, for example, show through their physical expertise certain ideal body conditions. They may personify great agility or strength or power, individual attributes, physical ideas, which are held up to others for their appreciation, and which signify to whatever extent abilities inherent in the species itself. I believe that man runs the mile much quicker now than he did, say, 30 years ago. Has the body's effective speed suddenly quickened? Hardly. Instead, mental beliefs about the body's performance have changed, and the increased physical speed resulted. The body can indeed run faster than the current record. I merely want to show the effects of beliefs upon physical performance. All people do not want to be expert runners, however. Their creativity and their ideals may lie in quite different fields of endeavor. But individual performance always adds to the knowledge of the species. Good, better, best. Is it bad to be a poor runner? Of course not, unless running is your own particular avocation. And if it is, you improve with practice. Now your ideas, whatever they may be, initially emerge from your inner experience, and this applies to the species as a whole. Your ideas of society and cooperation arise from both a biological and a spiritual knowledge given you at birth. Man recognized the importance of groups after observing the animals' cooperation. Your civilizations are your splendid, creative, exterior renditions of the inner social groupings of the cells of the body and the cooperative processes of nature that give you physical life. This does not mean that the intellect is any less, but that it uses its abilities to help you form physical civilizations that are the reflections of mental, spiritual, and biological inner civilizations. You learn from nature always, and you are a part of it always. Your searches toward understanding excellent performance in any area, your idealisms, all are spiritually and biologically ingrained. If many of the conditions we have mentioned in this book are less than ideal in your society, then you can, as an individual, begin to change those situations. You do this by accepting the tightness of your own personhood. You do this by discarding ideas of unworthiness and powerlessness, no matter what their sources. You do this by beginning to observe your own impulses, by trusting your own direction. You start wherever you are today. You do not dwell upon the unfortunate conditions of your environment, but you do take steps in your own life to express your ideas in whatever way is given. Those ways are multitudinous. Generally speaking, for example, if you are seriously worried about a physical condition, go to a doctor because your own beliefs may over-frighten you otherwise. Begin with innocuous but annoying physical conditions, however, and try to work those out for yourselves. Try to discover why you are bothered. When you have a headache or a simple stomach upset, or if you have a chronic, annoying but not serious condition, such as trouble with your sinuses, or if you have hay fever, in those situations, remind yourself that your body does indeed have the capacity to heal itself. Do the exercises in my book, The Nature of Personal Reality, to discover what conditions of a mental nature or of a psychological origin are causing your distress. Instead of taking an aspirin for a headache, sit down, breathe quietly, and remind yourself that you are an integral part of the universe. Allow yourself to feel a sense of belonging with nature. Such an exercise can often relieve a headache in no time, but each such experience will allow you to build up a sense of trust in your own body's processes. Examine the literature that you read, the television programs that you watch, and tell yourself to ignore those indications given of the body's weaknesses. Tell yourself to ignore literature or program that speak authoritatively about the species killer's instinct. Make an effort to free your intellect of such hampering beliefs. Take a chance on your own abilities. If you learn to trust your basic integrity as a person, then you will be able to assess your abilities clearly, neither exaggerating them or under-assessing them. You will not feel the need, say, to justify your existence by exaggerating a particular gift, setting up the performance of one particular feat or art as a rigid ideal, when in fact you may be pleasantly gifted but not greatly enough endowed with a certain ability to give you the outstanding praise you think you might deserve. On the other hand, there are many highly gifted people who continually put down their abilities and are afraid to take one small step toward their expression. If you accept the tightness of your life in the universe, then your ideals will be those in keeping with your nature. They will be fairly easily given expression, so that they add to your own fulfillment and to the development of the society as well. Your impulses are your closest communication with your inner self. because in the waking state they are the spontaneous urgings toward action, rising from that deep inner knowledge of yourself that you have in dreams. You were born because you had the impulse to be. The universe exists because it had the impulse to be. There was no exterior cosmic Pied Piper singing magical notes or playing a magical tune, urging the universe into being. The urge to be came from within, and that urge is repeated to some extent in each impulse, each urge toward action on the part of man or molecule. If you do not trust the nature of your impulses, then you do not trust the nature of your life, the nature of the universe, or the nature of your own being. Any animal knows better than to distrust the nature of its own life, and so does any infant. Nature exists by virtue of faith. The squirrels gather nuts in the faith that they will have provisions, in the faith that the next season will come and that spring will follow winter. Your impulses are immersed in the quality called faith, for they urge you into action in the faith that the moment for action exists. Your beliefs must interact with your Your beliefs must interact with your impulses, however, and often they can erode that great natural beneficial spontaneity that impulses can provide. Beliefs can erode that. When I speak of impulses, many of you will automatically think of impulses that appear contradictory or dangerous or evil, and that is because you are so convinced of the basic unworthiness of your being. You have every right to question your impulses, to choose among them, to assess them, but you must be aware of them. Acknowledge their existence, for they will lead you to your own true nature. This may involve a lengthy journey for some of you with your belief systems, for many of your impulses now are the result of the pressure caused by perfectly normal, unacknowledged ones in the past. But your impulses reflect the basic impulse of your life. Even if they appear contradictory at any given time, overall they will be seen to form a constructive pattern toward action that point more clearly towards your own clear path for fulfillment and development. Natural attributes show themselves quite clearly in early childhood, for example, when you are allowed greater freedom to do what you want to do. As children, some people love to work with words, some with images, some with objects. Some show great ability in dealing with their contemporaries, while others naturally lean toward solitude and private meditations. Look back toward the impulsive behavior of your childhood, toward those activities that mostly pleased you. If you painted pictures, this does not mean that you necessarily should be an artist. Only you know the strength of those impulses. But if they are intense and consistent, then pursue them. If you end up simply painting as a hobby, that will still enrich your life and understanding. If your impulses lead you toward relationships with others, then do not let fears of unworthiness stand in your way. It is very important that you express your idealism actively to whatever extent you can, for this increases your sense of worth and power. Such action serves as a safeguard so that you do not overemphasize the gaps that may exist in yourself or in society. Because the reality and the ideal, between the reality and the ideal condition. Let me read that sentence again. Such action serves as a safeguard so that you do not overemphasize the gaps that may exist in yourself or in society between the reality and the ideal condition. Many people want to change the world for the better, but that ideal seems so awe-inspiring that they think they can make no headway unless they perform some great acts of daring or heroism, or envision themselves in some political or religious place of power, or promote an uprising or a rebellion. The ideal seems so remote and unreachable that, again, sometimes any means, however reprehensible, eventually can seem justified. To change the world for the better, you must begin by changing your own life. There is no other way. You begin by accepting your own worth as a part of the universe and by granting every other being that same recognition. You began by honoring life in all of its forms. You began by changing your thoughts toward your contemporaries, your country, your family, your working companions. If the idea of loving your neighbor like yourself seems remote, you will at least absolutely refrain from killing your neighbor, and your neighbor is any other person on the face of the planet. You cannot love your neighbor, in fact, until you love yourself. And if you believe that it is wrong to love yourself, then you are indeed unable to love anyone else. For a start, you will acknowledge your existence in the framework of nature, and to do that you must recognize the vast cooperative processes that connect each species with each other one. If you truly use your prerogatives as an individual in your country, then you can exert far more power in normal daily living than you do now. Every time you affirm the tightness of your own existence, you help others. Your mental states are part of the planet's psychic atmosphere. End of dictation. Now Seth came through with a couple of paragraphs of material for Jane, here deleted. Then at 10:31. A note. Your exterior civilizations do indeed mirror and reflect the great cellular civilizations, so that you try to exteriorize that kind of order and creativity. Many of your technological advances, all of them for that matter, are rather interpretations of the inner mechanisms of nature, sonar, radar, and so forth, as you attempt to physically or objectively reproduce the inner realities of nature. I have mentioned civilizations often before, but it is sometimes almost impossible to verbally describe civilizations of scent civilizations built upon temperature variations, alphabets are of color. This one's messed up because I didn't know what word they were meaning there. Start again. But it sometimes is almost impossible to verbally describe civilizations of scent, civilizations built upon temperature variations, alphabets of color, pressure gradations, all of these highly intimate and organized, but quite outside of verbal representation. You would have to have additional material, nonverbal, to approach an understanding of such matters. In your lives, anything you want is possible within the contours of your natures, if only you understand that this is so. Do you have any questions? No, actually I did, a lot of them, particularly concerning certain themes I've been writing about lately, but I was tiring, so I let the questions go. After a few comments about Jane's and my belief systems, Seth said good night. You did well tonight, I told Jane. Her delivery had been very fast and obviously deeply felt. More than once I'd seen her produce excellent material like she had tonight, even though before a session she'd announced a reservation about holding it for one reason or another. Yes, tonight I just did it to do it, Jane said. I have sessions now at times when I wouldn't have bothered to in the past. I was getting stuff from Seth before the session, but I haven't the slightest idea of what he said in the session itself. I don't remember anything, but it was good, huh? Session 872. As we waited for tonight's session to begin, I read to Jane a letter I've just written to a prominent biologist. I'm asking his help in obtaining source material for the visual evidence for evolution, showing the forms involved, say, as little by little the descendants of the reptile changed into the bird. By evidence in this case I mean drawings based upon the best scientific assumptions as to what all of those intermediate creatures must have looked like. I also wanted estimates as to how they survived for so many millennia while the changes took place. As far as I've been able to learn, no such transitional fossils have been found, like the discrete forms of reptiles and birds that have been discovered. So I decided to search out the next best thing, the visual representations as to what they must have looked like. But what good were the developing stages of a wing, I wondered, and how many uncounted generations of reptiles turning into birds had to carry those appendages before a fully formed bird was finally hatched that could fly? Would nature do things that way? I'm a professional artist, I wrote to the scientists, and at times have been puzzled enough by questions about evolution to consider making my own series of drawings that would show the transformation from reptile to bird, for instance, just to see if I could do it convincingly. But each time I started visualizing the results, I'd end up with two notions. First, that as I work with those intermediate forms, I'd become involved with myth and fantasy rather than fact. Just how did reptiles change into birds? What kind of intermediate forms were there? Second, the idea of my drawings makes me think that others must have done it already, not once but many times. So what I really want to ask you for are references to later textbooks that are more clear and precise than those I have on the origin of major new species. I'm especially interested in visual data. Okay, I'm going to skip over some of this right here. Good evening. Good evening, Seth. Dictation. It may seem to some readers that the subject matter of this book is far divorced from any discussion of the specific development of psychic abilities. Many people write requesting that I outline the proper methods for achieving astral projection, for example, or psychic advancement, or spiritual understanding. In its fashion, however, this book is geared to bring about the development of such abilities, for it is not a lack of methods that inhibits such activities. Instead, psychic progress is hampered by those very negative beliefs that we have tried to bring to your attention. Many of you keep searching for some seemingly remote spiritual inner self that you can trust and look to for help and support, but all the while you distrust the familiar self with which you have such intimate contact. You set up divisions between portions of the self that are unnecessary. Some correspondents write, I realize that I am too egotistical. There are many schools for spiritual advancement that teach you to get rid of the clutter of your impulses and desires, to shove aside the self that you are in search of a greater, idealized version. First of all, the self is you. It is ever-changing and never static. There is an inner self in the terms of those definitions, but that inner self, which is the source of your present being, speaks through your impulses. They provide inbuilt spiritual and biological impetuses toward your most ideal development. You must trust the self that you are, now. If you would know yourself in deepest terms, you must start with your own feelings, emotions, desires, intents, and impulses. Spiritual knowledge and psychic wisdom are the natural result of a sense of self-unity. Again, impulses are inherently good, both spiritually and biologically. They emerge from framework 2, from the inner self, and they are based on the great inner webwork of communication that exists among all species on your planet. Impulses also provide the natural impetus toward those patterns of behavior that serve you best, so that while certain impulses may bunch up toward the physical activity, say, others, seemingly contradictory, will lead toward quiet contemplation, so that overall certain balances are maintained. Some people are only aware of, or largely aware of, impetuses toward anger, because they have inhibited those natural impulses toward love that would otherwise temper what seems to be aggressive desires. When you begin trusting yourself, you start by taking it for granted that to some extent at least you have not trusted yourself or your impulses in the past. You have thought that impulses were dangerous, disruptive, or even evil. So as you begin to learn self-trust, you acknowledge your impulses. You try them on for size. You see where they lead you by allowing them some freedom. You do not follow urges through that would hurt others physically, or that seem in direct contradiction lost my place. You do not follow urges through that would hurt others physically or that seem in direct contradiction to your present beliefs, but you do acknowledge them. You do try to discover their source. Behind them you will almost always find an inhibited impulse, or many of them, that motivated you to move in some ideal direction, to seek a love or understanding so idealized in your mind that it seemed impossible to achieve. You are left with the impulse to strike out. If you examine such troublesome stimuli, you will always find that they originally rose after a long process, a process in which you were afraid to take small positive steps towards some ideal. Your own impulses naturally lead you to seek creative fulfillment, the expansion of your consciousness, psychic excursions, and the conscious knowledge and manipulation of your dreams. No methods will work if you are afraid of your own impulses or of the nature of your own being. Most of you understand that all that is within you, that God is within creation, within physical matter, and that He does not simply operate as some cosmic director on the outside of reality. You must understand that the spiritual self also exists within the physical self in the same fashion. The inner self is not remote either, not divorced from your most intimate desires and affairs, but instead communicates through your own smallest gesture, through your smallest ideal. This sense of division within the self forces you to think that there is a remote, spiritual, wise, intuitive inner self and a bewildered, put-upon, spiritually ignorant, inferior physical self, which happens to be the one you identify with. Many of you believe, moreover, that the physical self's very nature is evil, that its impulses, left alone, will run in direct opposition to the good of the physical world and society, and fly in the face of the deeper spiritual truths of inner reality. The inner self then becomes so idealized and so remote that by contrast the physical self seems only the more ignorant and flawed. In the face of such beliefs, the ideal of psychic development or astral travel or spiritual knowledge or even of sane living seems so remote as to be impossible. You must therefore begin to celebrate your own beings, to look to your own impulses as being the natural connectors between the physical and the non-physical self. Children trusting their impulses learn to walk, and trusting your impulses you can find yourselves again. End of dictation. Give us a moment. Consciousness predates physical forms. Consciousness predates the physical universe. Consciousness predates all of its manifestations. The impulse to be, in any terms that you can understand, is without beginning or end. What you have in your physical species are the manifestations of inner species of being, are creative groupings originated by consciousness as material patterns into which consciousness then flows. In those terms, the world came into being, and the species appeared in a completely different framework of activity than is imagined, and one that cannot be scientifically established, particularly within those boundaries with which science has protected itself. The patterns for the earth and for its creatures were as real before their physical appearance and far more real than, say, the plan for a painting that you might have in your mind. The universe always was innately objective in your terms, with its planets and creatures. The patterns for all of the species always existed without any before or after arrangement. I am not pleased with these analogies, but sometimes they are all I can use to express issues so outside of normal channels of knowledge. It is as if then the earth, with all of its species, existed in complete form as a fully dimensional cosmic underpainting, which gradually came alive all at once. Birds did not come from reptiles. They were always birds. They expressed a certain kind of consciousness that sought a certain kind of form. Physically, the species appeared. All species appeared in the same way that you might imagine all of the elements of a highly complicated dream suddenly coming alive with physical properties. Mental images in those terms now existed that in a flash of cosmic inspiration were suddenly endowed with full physical manifestation. To that extent, the Bible's interpretation is correct. Life was given, was free to develop according to its characteristic conditions. The planet was prepared and endowed with life. Consciousness built the forms, so life existed within consciousness for all eternity. There was no point in which chemicals or atoms suddenly acquired life, for they always possessed consciousness, which is life's requirement. In the terms that you understand, all species that are aware of appeared more or less at once. All species that you are aware of appeared more or less at once. Because the mental patterns had peaked, their vitality was strong enough to form differentiation and cooperation within the framework of matter. I understand that it appears that species have vanished, but again you must remember probabilities, and that those species simply developed along the patterns of probable Earths. You are not just dealing with a one-line development of matter, but of an unimaginable creativity in which all versions of your physical world exist, each one quite convinced of its physical nature. There are ramifications quite unspeakable, although in certain states of trance, or with the aid of educated dreaming, you might be able to glimpse the inner complications, the webworks of communications that connect your official Earth with other probable ones. You choose your time and focus in physical reality again and again, and the mind holds an inner comprehension of many seemingly mysterious developments involving the species. Even the cells are free enough of time and space to hold an intimate framework of being within the present, while being surrounded by this greater knowledge of what you think of as the Earth's past. In greater terms, the Earth and all of its species are created in each moment. You wonder what gave life to the first egg or seed or whatever, and think that an answer to that question would answer most others, for life, you say, was simply passed on from that point. But what gives life to the egg or the seed now, keeps it going, provides that energy? Imagining some great Big Bang theory to explain the creation of the universe gives you an immense explosion of energy that somehow turns into life, but must wear out somewhere along the line. And if that were the case, life would be getting weaker all the time. But it is not. The child is as new and fresh today as a child was 5,000 years ago, and each spring is as new. What gives life to chemicals now? That is the more proper question. All energy is not only awareized, but the source of all organizations of consciousness and all physical forms. These represent frameworks of consciousness. There was a day when the dreaming world, in your terms, suddenly awakened to full reality as far as physical manifestation is concerned. The planet was visited by desire. There were ghost excursions there, mental buildings, dream civilizations, which then became actualized. End of session. There is much left unsaid. Yes. My fondest regards to each of you, and tell Rupert to remember the power of thought. Okay, good night. I don't know where the hell I was tonight, Jane said. I might as well have been without a body. I was far out. The only thing I could feel was that he was trying to find analogies to make clear that section about evolution. Actually, what I got was, my feelings is that we don't have the concepts yet for something that seems so alien to our ordinary reality. No matter how hard we try, even you and me, but I don't mean that personally or anything. I guess the feeling I was getting was that some part of consciousness dreamed of the earth and visited it all the time, and then some part woke up in it and became it for a while with whatever it needed already there. Do you realize that the transformations in belief that would have to take place before this material was even considered by the elite or something, let alone accepted? I ask, it would destroy the world of a scientist who believed in evolution. That is, if he would pay any attention to it to begin with. My remark reminded Jane that this afternoon she had found herself thinking that science should at least consider any information, no matter where it came from. Then from Seth she had picked up that she was wrong, that her kind of information would be considered non-information, and so would be ignored. But no matter, for it certainly seems that with his material on evolution this evening, Seth was preparing for his next book, Dreams, Evolution, and Value Fulfillment. And I will begin the next session in the next video. This is Deaf Lady, over and out for now.